mouth breather. This is my third attempt to record my first video of 2021. The second attempt was earlier tonight, and then once close to the new year. And both times, I somehow failed to actually turn on the record button before going through my whole spiel, which was a pretty demoralizing experience because I am fundamentally incapable of repeating myself exactly, at least within the space of however long my memory of the event lasts. So I was pretty disgusted by having both of those, for lack of a better term, performances obliviated by my own stupidity. But quitters never win, as the saying goes. So I'm making one more attempt. The computer tells me that I am recording now, so I really hope that that's accurate. And for lack of other subject matter, I am going to finally put the long-delayed capstone on the only coherent series that I have had in this entire channel's existence, which was the description of the 5 conventions of the Technocratic Union in the setting of the role-playing game Mage the Ascension. The idea of talking about Mage to an audience that is pretty much a couple of years past the 20th anniversary of the game, and thus very few of the people who came back to the hobby after 20 years have kept it up this long. But just on the off chance that somebody out there might care, why don't I give fairly basic information that most devotees of the game already know. So, it's about as pointless a subject as you could ask for, but at least it's something. So, hopefully this gets me out of my rut and gets me some momentum back. So, the first 3 videos, other than my intro, were all part of a series called Filthy Lucre, where I was attempting to process my feelings about the early days of the coronavirus insanity, and specifically a visit to the store where I bought this webcam. And I talked about the 3 of the 5 conventions. The Progenitors, the Syndicate, and the... Sorry, this is bothering me. Okay, let's try this. I talked about the Progenitors, the Syndicate, and a part of Iteration X, and briefly described the rest of Iteration X. And a few months later, I got around to doing a follow-up where I talked about the Iteration X. Now, all 4 of these are in the role-playing game. They are presented as bad guy groups, but in all cases they are based on real-life archetypes. And just as the heroic good guy mages are based on archetypes such as the miracle-working priest, the Native American shaman, the old wise woman from European folklore, anybody who has seen the television show American Gods should immediately perceive a parallel, because in that show there's the minor spoiler for a show that takes like 4 episodes before it reveals its basic premise, but anybody who has seen the show quickly finds out that, or has read the book, or has any, it's fairly basic knowledge, so don't feel too bad about the spoiler. It is revealed in that show that the old pagan gods are fighting a sort of war against gods of the modern era, such as there's one who's basically the god of conspiracy theories, one who's the god of technology, one who's the god of media and Hollywood. They are going up against old pagan gods, and so in a similar vein, Mage is in large part about the conflict between the old and the new, where the heroic mages are preserving an ancient tradition, and the sinister technocracy is trying to wipe them out. Now, I bring all this up in my rambly way to point out that the progenitors are doctors, the syndicate are businessmen, the New World Order are government spooks, and Iteration X are basically everything else covered by the label of scientist. And all of that is, so those four conventions are all very grounded in day-to-day reality of the world that we live in and the world that the wizards are trying to survive within. And then the fifth convention is the odd man out in that regard and in several others. They are eventually, the technocracy were never really bad guys so much as, they were antagonistic, and they certainly could be sinister or even evil, but generally as an organization they were less arch nemeses than they were kind of obstructionist bureaucrat types who would just, they intended to suppress the heroic wizards, possibly through drastic means, but they were not like pure evil. There were much worse evils where actually one of the main reasons why the technocracy was as draconian as they were was because they had it in their mind that they were going to protect the normal people of the world from all of the worse evils that the heroic mages were kind of closer to, because they did not use science and technology. They were using magic, and so that put them closer to using evil magic, and the technomancers couldn't really distinguish between evil and non-evil magic, so they just kind of wanted to get rid of all magic that wasn't their own magic disguised as science. All of that is, so like I said, the four described conventions were all very much active on Earth and disguised as normal members of Earth society, and so they were the ones that came into conflict with our heroes, the mages, a lot. Then, when you go out to the entire rest of the universe, you would run into the fifth convention, who were known as the Void Engineers, and there was less direct conflict between them and the good guys because they were mostly not operating on Earth. They would operate in the far reaches of space, or the bottoms of the sea, or the tops of the highest mountains. They were the convention of explorers and frontiersmen, the astrologers who chart the heavens and then built various machines in order to travel out to the stars and sort of secure the future of humanity in the greater cosmos. One kind of problem with Mage the Ascension is the fact that it sort of had the cosmology of the other games published by the same company stapled onto it and forcibly made compatible with it, even though they had very different sort of theming. So one of the ways that got stupid is that the one of the other game lines is called Werewolf, and in that it was made out that the werewolves were spiritual creatures that were sort of defenders of the spirit world from humanity, and so perceived as monsters by humans because they tended to like killing us, but they were killing us in the name of the Earth Mother Goddess who they served, who was the greatest of all spirits, and there was an entire universe of other spirits that were, godlike primordial beings responsible for the powers of nature, And so there was an entire universe of these spirits that potentially stretched off into the far depths of the cosmos, although the werewolves didn't tend to travel out very far. They basically would go as far as the moon and not much further, because nothing out further than that interested them. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is that in Mage, again, partly because of the forced compatibility with Werewolf, the technocracy, so the outer space that the technocracy would send spaceships to explore was a different perception of the same spirit world that the werewolves would travel through on beams of moonlight that they would walk along with the aid of a spirit guide. Like I said, completely bizarre game, but because the conceit of Mage's universe is that everything is sort of shaped by belief, there's a tangential topic in there that I might come back to at another time. The idea is that if people believed that, going back to the Ptolemaic cosmology, if people believed that the stars were embedded in a crystal dome that was the sky, and there was nothing beyond that other than swirling ether of the outer howling void, then supposedly that belief actually became true, and then when the technocracy came along and began advancing the scientific worldview, the spirit world actually changed in order to befit that. And so the idea is that the Void Engineers, who started out as frontiersmen exploring all the wild places of the Earth until they sort of domesticated the entire planet, they then traveled out to beyond the sky in order to perform the same function there and battle against all sorts of spirits that were to varying degrees hostile to humanity or expecting humanity to limit its ambitions in ways that the technocracy was not okay with, because they are very ambitious people, just like the actual mages are. So it's a very sort of deep well of lore in the game, and in order to keep my video fairly short, I'm not going to go into that lore very much, more than I already have sort of hinted at it. I could talk about the Void Engineers quite extensively, and one of the reasons why I kept them back as a subject, besides all the other reasons I've alluded to, is because a lot of what can be talked about them comes in the form of discussions of other science fiction stories, various television stories, television shows, movies, books that have the science fiction concept and are set in outer space. Especially the ones with a somewhat militaristic bent, because that's kind of how the Void Engineers are organized. They're kind of scientists, but also kind of soldiers, and they have the obedience to hierarchical command structure thing. So a show like Star Trek or Babylon 5 or Battlestar Galactica or Stargate SG-1, these are all shows that make good metaphors for how the Void Engineers work. Star Trek is the least so, because it's very idealistic, and the technocracy are not idealistic at all. They're very cynical and pragmatic. Stargate is a lot closer, and Battlestar Galactica is a lot closer, and Babylon 5 is sort of in the middle. And there's no doubt other shows that could be mentioned if I was familiar with them, but those are the, Battlestar Galactica I've seen a little bit of, but the other three I'm very, very familiar with. I've watched all the way through Babylon 5 multiple times. I've watched almost every episode of Star Trek and almost every episode of Stargate, though not the two spin-off series. Anyway, so there's a lot of inspiration for what you can do with the Void Engineers that you can get by looking at science fiction. But like I said, they don't come into contact with the Earthbound sections as often when they are on Earth at all, they're generally in uncivilized areas of Earth. They have very little reason to hang out in cities and whatnot, so they don't tend to meet the other participants in a mage setting very often, and so it's kind of appropriate that they are off in their own video so far away from the other videos that I've talked about this subject. One other little wrinkle that I won't get into very much is that it is sort of portrayed, at least in parts of the meta plot of Mage, that if a group of the technocracy was going to leave and stop cooperating with their sinister agenda for world domination, the Void Engineers might be the ones. They spend the most time out in deep space and are potentially able to be sort of corrupted by that, but also sort of deprogrammed away from some of the indoctrination that the technocracy does. And because they don't spend as much time at war with the mages, they are sort of, if not sympathetic, then at least less unsympathetic towards them. And so, back when I was actually running Mage, I latched onto the idea of having the Void Engineers potentially turncoat. Without getting too much into the factions of Mage, there are 9 groups of mages, and 2 of them are ex-technocracy. So, not that they were organized along these lines, but there was a time when there were still 9 of them. There were still 9 of the mages back then, because they think that 9 is a sacred number, but 7 of the ones that exist now, and 2 others that were extinct, existed, and at that time there were more or less, depending on the exact chronology, there were around 7 Technomancer factions, and then 2 of them turned against the Technocratic Union, because they were invested in one case they were invested in sciences that were declared obsolete, and then in the other case they were pursuing a kind of technological bleeding edge that they did not want the technocracy holding them back on. So if I decide to turn this dabbling in the technocracy bit into a larger series of videos talking about Mage, then I will describe those factions in more detail. For now, I'll just be content with the fact that this is by far my longest video yet, and we'll see if we can get back to my usual insane conspiratorial ramblings that aren't about a role-playing game later on.